all right. Clearly, the Peacock's development, the motorway, the Waikato, the Hamilton City Council's ring roads, and all the work they're doing here is massive infrastructure expenditure. So how they can say that they're not, that this would make a huge difference to it when they're piling in investment, as you are too in the Tamihere village and a few other places, and Matangi and some other places, how you can suggest in a planning document that this would, this is a reason not to increase the density. I don't understand it. It's happening anyhow, and you're responding to it, so why not just put a little bit more capacity on top of it? Reducing from 5,000, point number 2, reducing 5,000 to 4,000 square meters will have no impact on the ability to install septic tanks for wastewater. Very little impact on water on the CLZ section, where water supply is mostly on trickle supply already, needing its own pumped water storage. So, you know, the three waters actually doesn't make too much sense. The same for stormwater. So there is a water issue. I understand there are water issues everywhere in New Zealand, and of course it is a vital part, but the Section 42 report really did not cover anything in depth in this area, in this section, that really provided quantified numbers to object. Now, I mean, and nor did Hamilton City Council. There was just a very glib statement that such a development will detract from growth in towns. These are very, very glib statements. They're not backed up by solid technical evidence. If there was a requirement, if I would like to see, if for a decision this important, as an engineer and a management consultant, I would have thought planning over a 20-year boundary, 20-year horizon, which is absolutely core business for local government and Waikato District Council, that you make the decision to go from 5,000 to stay with 5,000 or go reduce to 4,000 based on infrastructure to be very quantifiable and data verifiable. And there were very few statements in the Section 42 report that identified this, and the few that were, I address in this presentation. So stormwater is a 20% reduction in size. I cannot see how that would have an impact, but I'm not an expert. The publicized policies, point number 4 on slide number 6, the publicized policies of development by Waikato District Council and Hamilton City Council have identified intensification beside and within Tamihere Clean Country Living Zone. So it's already happening. So how is it that, you know, a few kilometers away, it's already happening, but you're arguing that this should not happen, that you shouldn't intensify, and we should keep, the only reason that I can see is that you can keep the character of the country living zone, and we'll come to that in a moment, but we've got to define what the character is, and I don't think it's been defined correctly by the Section 42 report. Well, I don't think it's been adequately addressed by the Section 42 report, not characterized properly, because it hasn't been characterized. There must be experts who do that, and I'm not an expert. So my view on this slide, to conclude this slide, 6 is that Hamilton City Council objections based on the undesirable impacts of social infrastructure and detracting from growth in towns and other identified locations for growth are clearly incorrect. It flies in the face of what's actually happening at a high level, both in Hamilton City Council and Waikato District Council, and the region, and the corridor between Auckland to Hamilton. There's a whole lot of issues that this is ignoring. So I'm now on, oh, what's happened? I'm now on slide 7. This is an example of, this is just a slide of Peacock development, just to point out, to strengthen the point that I've just been making, that the Waikato District Council Country Living Zone is right, abutting the Peacock development, which is 290 million, gives about 862 extra residential plots, So there's a whole lot of infrastructure being poured into that area, literally a kilometre or two away from us. And yet the argument is, well, we mustn't take account of that. We live in silos. And I'm arguing here that, you know, silo mentality is absolutely not, I'm sorry, that's going to ring 3 times. Oh, yeah.
That's okay. We can
cope with that. Thank you. I emphasize that the objections to reducing 5,000 square meters to 4,000, 3,000, 2,500, the objections to them were not numerical. There was no quantifiable evidence to say that those infrastructure issues, which if they were existent, of course we couldn't. I'd be the first not to. I'd be the first to accept them. If there were real restrictions on the infrastructure due to reducing the allotment size, then it's real. It's the truth. We have to act in the interest of the community. We must not do it at that point. But that's not my argument. My argument is it hasn't been investigated properly and it's been dismissed too easily as a statement of traditional country planning or town planning. I mean, it's a very big and complicated area, and I take my hat off to people who, you know, to you people, all of you and your staff, to manage the issues that are involved are incredibly complex and wide and deep, and it's quite amazing. You know, it is really quite amazing to dip into this as I have done. I've only dipped into it. And I'm just amazed at how complicated it all is and how you've got to balance people's interests and how you take care that you're not captured by particular interests, and you've got a statement of declared interests. It's fantastic. I mean, I'm very proud to be a New Zealander to see that you're doing
I don't think you need to worry too much about patting us on the back. I think it's just helpful to us if you
onwards.
If you just carry on and tell us what you want to tell us about the district plan. I think that would be the most helpful thing for you to do.
Sorry about that. Okay, right. Well, I'm on slide number, oh, damn. What am I on? Slide number, unfortunately, for some reason, I've clicked a presentation here that's...
I think you're on slide 8, I think.
Yeah, slide 8. Thank you. Slide 8. So here is the graph of the reason. Now, this is a reason that the Section 42 report says they've discounted Tamihere in their accounting for what would happen when the allotment size went down. Now, I'm not making much of a point here other than to say I do not understand why they've discounted that when Tamihere accounts for 47% of the subdividable land. And as far as I can tell from the next slide, counting up the number of allotments that are affected by the airport, there's only 130. So if you look at the graph and you see the 1,000 line on the graph, well, the Tamihere graph drops to 1,000 or just over 1,000, and still, you know, it's probably 40% of the whole of the total. How should we, to discount that and pull that right out and say we won't include it, flies in the face of any systematic analysis. I can't understand why that is, and maybe because I'm not a planner, there is a good reason for this. But my argument here is that it also demonstrates how important the Tamihere district is to the country living zone, and how important it is to Waikato District Council finances. It's probably disproportionate, it's probably well, you know, if you looked at the rating base of the income coming from this graph, all these properties along, Tamihere would be well out of proportion in terms of its rateable income to Waikato District Council. Now, that relies on some information I can remember reading previously, and I haven't referred to it here, but I'm pretty certain that's the case. So, you know, Tamihere is not to be ignored or pulled aside. And the next slide, number 9, shows a diagram, again, really just making the point. The table at the bottom is one that's shown in the Section 42 report, which has an implication that those numbers are negative. Everything other than the 5,000 status quo is a negative. And I would argue that this is fundamentally flawed to think like this. I know if the more allotments created puts greater pressure on the country living zone. Of course it does. On Waikato District Council, of course it does. But with it comes a whole lot of benefits. And it's the benefits that have not been weighed up in this situation. So as you can see, the other point on this graph that's very visible is that the tongue there from the noise control authority is only a small one. It's a small proportion of the country living zone, which can be seen in the next slide, number 10. You can see there's a sort of, on my screen it's brown, but on the original screen it showed it was purple, was the outline of the noise control. So inside there you're not allowed to subdivide, and so the reason why the Section 42 report discounted Tamihere is because, well, this is my understanding, is because those lots inside that tongue discounted the whole of the country living zone because those could not be subdivided. But there's a lot there that can. So they can't be subdivided for noise reasons. Well, you know, there are a lot that can. So I'm struggling to understand the rationale of the analysis, and that just throws question on the whole rationale. The next point is slide number 11. The other important objection received from the Tamihere Community Committee provided no objection, and I'm sorry, but I have to make the point that my fellow Tamihere residents might easily consider that if they have subdivisable land, that value of that land will go up. If it can't be, no other land can be subdivided easily. So clearly, if you reduced the allotment side from 5,000 to 4,000 or anything less, there would be much more land. Would be more land came available, as shown by the Section 42 report, and obviously the speed and price increases, and or even the price themselves might decrease when that happened. But I'm arguing that this is in the community's interest.
Bridget, I'm just going to ask you to move along a little bit. Our standard procedure is that the information is provided ahead of time so that we pre-read it, and we're giving people, unless they seek leave, 10 minutes more or less to summarise things.
Right.
So we've got your slides. Let me just finish. We have read through the slides during the course of the day, during lunchtime and during our afternoon tea break. So if you can stick to the slides and tell us the key points that you want us to take account of. Because it's getting a little bit repetitive.
Sorry about that. I beg your pardon. Look, I'll try and finish. There's 3 more slides. I'll try and make.
Please carry on, but just make your point, because that's and what you want us to do, because that's what we're here to do. Okay.
So I'm pointing out that I'm on slide 14 now, which identifies that. The Section 42 report identifies that maintaining density is one of the reasons they didn't want to change the 5,000 square meter size, and I'm pointing out that that is an actual is completely incorrect, because the pressure of the pressures that we already know. One of the points that hasn't been made yet is that the modification, the country living zones, the rural zones have rich soils, and so by increasing the density, you'd offset the pressure on the rural zone. It's acting as a transition. At the moment, it's a barrier. Point number 3 is basically saying that the main objection seems to lie in what is called the character of country living. But there's very little, in fact, there's no evidence of what desirable character of country living means in the Section 42 report. Maybe it's, well, no, I would argue it should be there if you're using it as evidence to reject submissions. Any submission that asks for a reduction, and you're saying that the character of country living is the reason you've used to reject them. I'm sorry, I don't see any evidence of what that means. And I've already mentioned, for example, that if you drive around Tamihere, you won't see very many country living zones with lots of animals on them. They're mainly mowed. We have a person who sits, anyhow. So the point I'm making is that there has to be evidence of concrete evidence of what country living means and how valuable it is to the community, because you're trading off against these pressures that are existing, that we're all talking about in the newspapers. Pressure of cities having to grow and housing having to be built. So for God's sake, how is it that something that character of country living is given so much importance that it's allowed to sit there and be a reason without any evidence? And that is one of our fundamental issues, objections to this to the district plan. So that's item 4, and I go on to slide number 15, the last but one, and make a small point there that certainly as an 18-year resident in this area, I've had many conversations where farmers have told me the paddocks are too small to put in large animals. They're okay for sheep, but cows and horses, we couldn't. We had to open them all up so they could just be added. The land had to be just added to the existing farm. It wasn't going to work as an allotment for us to own the sheep, or sorry, for us to own the cows. In a very important point. Is that this is the country living zone in Tamihere represents a disproportionate ratepayer base, and it needs to be carefully thought through from various angles, not just a town planning perspective, but from an economic development opportunity. And I believe that this is more an area that I am experiencing, and this is an obvious point that with a very small ratepayer base, with a huge amount of land. I think you're unique in New Zealand, or one of the top unique ones, when having such a large area of land to look after with a very small ratepayer base. You really need to be thinking of economic development, not just purist town planning issues. And this is one of those areas that would really benefit from it. Point 7 is the Section 42 report suggests, based on analysis, that the 5,000, based on analysis above, which was very thin, I'm afraid, and my opinion that the minimum lot size should be retained to ensure the potential lot yield does not result in title sizes similar to the proposed village zone. Well, again, I could find no understanding and no economic or amenity value or to understand what was being referred to here, because the village zone has a cap at the moment of 3,000 square meters and being proposed at 2,500 square meters, which is a long way different from, for argument's sake, the 4,000 that I've suggested. And it seems to be a very academic perspective on the whole situation, rather than the one that I think needs to be taken was a strategic one. And finally, in conclusion, I restate my point, which is a bit repetitive. I believe there needs to be further investigated to clarify and compare the consequence of retaining status quo 5,000 square meters allotment size against options of decreasing it. And in my view, the strength of my argument has increased to bring it down incrementally to 4,000, just a little bit, not a hard, not to make the big, not to jump into the problems that the Section 42 report very clearly identified, but just to edge into it and see where it goes, with greater emphasis on the strategic drivers that have driven HCC and WDC to invest currently. I mean, it's investment already taking. It's doing active planning. It's doing active investment in this areas. So how is it that there's a disjoint between what the district plan is suggesting, which is no status quo, and yet all these other things are changing? And finally, where the character and integrity of country living is going to use to count against these strategic drivers more quantifiable data, such as the surveys or what it actually means. You know, a drive around with a person and a checklist just to say, well, what is the character of the area at the moment? I think would show it's more residential and urban with huge lot sizes that are residential and urban. So let's take account of that. That's what people have wanted. That's what people have bought. That's what people are living. So that and that is my submission.
Thank you, Mr. Bridger. I should just, before we see if there's any questions, I omitted to welcome you, Mrs. Robertson. I don't think you were quite live when I did that, so I see you sitting there, and we'll get to you shortly, but welcome. Right, let's see if there's any questions of Mr. Bridger. Ms. Tiaho?
No, that was very clear. I know what you're saying, and I see what you're asking for.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, no, but I think, Mr. Bridges, you'll realise that there's requests for, you know, 4,000 in your request, 3,000 from some others, and down to 2,500. So we've got all that to balance. And I realise that the area that you live in, on Poplar Lane, was one of the very early ones, which has got very large sections. But we're looking at this as a whole district, and we'll get a large amount of requests, I expect, for change of land use to country living zones as we work through it. So while we're talking about Tamahere in your submission, we've got to be very mindful of the whole district as we do that. And if we start reducing them in one zone, we're going to find there's going to come pressures on from other ones as well. So yeah, thank you for your submission. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kearney, any questions from you?
Just one. Mr. Bridger, why did you choose to live in that area? You know, with given the size of the property, etc. Why did you choose?
Oh, well, that's, I would have thought an easy answer because it's just so beautiful. So beautiful.
Lifestyle choice?
Well, you see, what does lifestyle choice mean? To me, okay, so to me, it was a large property that had lots of trees on it and had a large house. That was it. So that you've put your finger on the point that I'm making, as opposed to the academic approach taken by the Section 42 report, because to me, I think that's what most of Tamahere is like. That's what lifestyle means. It's not really, because lifestyle to me is the good life on the television where you've got cows and sheep, and that's not what I'm doing.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bridger. I don't have any questions. I think what you've said is very clear. And as Mr. Fulton has said, we've got quite a contrast of views on various things that we'll have to weigh carefully before we make any final decisions, which I think you might have heard me before say that's at least 12 months away, given that we're hearing all the evidence on all the chapters in the plan before we make any final decisions. So you won't be hearing from us for a while. But thank you very much for your presentation, and we wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you, and well done, all of you again.
Thank you.
It's amazing.
Thank you. And you're welcome to stay and listen to everybody else, but you're also free to go, whatever suits you best. Mr. Wilson from Fish and Game is next customer. Thank you.
Okay, you can hear me okay?
We certainly can, thanks.
My apologies, we didn't get the written evidence out to you a lot earlier. It was an oversight.
Well, these are challenging times, so we'll give you a leave pass this time.
Yeah. Have you seen it? Have you read it? Or
Yes, have read it.
Yeah.
Would you like me to read it out, or would you like me just to discuss
I don't think we need you to read it out. I think, but if you can highlight for us the issue and what you want us to do about it, I think that will be fine.
Okay. Well, I guess the issue for us is that the country living zone adjoins the Waikato River in several places for quite considerable lengths. And so there are two issues there. One is that there are already mai located in the country living zone. especially along the banks of the Waikato River and a few of the larger properties. The other issue is it affects our management, and that we would like to gradually phase out drift shooting from the Waikato River. Now, drift shooting is when people just drift down with the current, generally just outside the willows, shooting ducks as they drift downstream. And because of the prolific, the increased number of walkways along the river, that's no longer increasingly a viable method of hunting. So we are trying to encourage hunters to take fixed stands along the river. And we can't do that under the proposed country living zone. I think it's important to note that game bird hunting is reasonably safe. We are dealing with sort of a short range weapon, I guess. And I think this is sort of an issue for us, not just in the country living zone, but pretty much throughout the whole district. And we're going to come across this in other zones. My as permitted activity has already been accepted in hearing.
Rural and village, I think, is what you're going to tell us.
Yep, thank you. So we would like to see it also accepted in the country living zone. I think we don't see there's any safety issues with it. If we go to the objections from the hearing officer, who believed it wouldn't be safe, it's not safe to fire a gun in a country living zone. Well, I mean, obviously the country living zone still includes some quite large sections now, and as I said, it borders onto the Waikato River. And I think that's also controlled by the legislation, including the Firearms Act. I mean, you can't just go and hunt ducks whenever. There's other legislation that has to be taken into consideration. The next objection was the mai-mai may be repurposed. Well, if a mai-mai is repurposed, it's no longer a mai-mai. Under the Building Act, it's got to be under 10 square metres, and it can't contain permanent dwelling fixtures such as stoves, sinks, toilets, etc. And we believe it isn't in character at the moment. I mean, the mere fact that there are already a reasonable number of mai-mai in the zone, and it doesn't seem to have raised any issues. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, that's clear. We understand what you're asking and the reasons for it. I think let's just see if there's any questions. Mr. Fulton?
No, you told me about the Tamahiri zone, which is one of the biggest along the river, I would expect, is it?
Yep.
And you do have mai-mais there already?
Yep. My understanding there's 3 there.
3? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
It's quite, that part of the river is quite, I was trying to think the word, it's got fairly large cliffs along the sides and farmland across the river at the moment. I mean, that might change, but if it changes, it changes. But at the moment, it's a pretty safe area for shooting out of fixed stands.
Okay, thank you. Good.
All right, thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
Nothing from me, thanks.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wilson.
No, I don't have anything either. I don't think, Mr. Wilson, it's pretty clear. I mean, it's you've explained it clearly. What you want's clearly explained, and we'll just deliberate on that and decide in due course, as they say.
Due course. Yep, okay, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Robertson, don't forget to turn your microphone on. Your microphone's still off. You need to unmute yourself.
Yep.
There we go.
Are we there?
We are.
Oh, great. Sorry, just a bit new to this.
No, that's okay. Well, it's a bit novel, but I think you'll find it's. We found it really useful, and we found it, I think, pretty much the same as sitting in a room, except we don't physically have to all drive to the same place to do it. So try and relax, don't stress out about it. Just tell us what you want to tell us, and we'll take it from there. We have seen your little summary document. You don't need to read that. As with Mr. Wilson, we're just keen to hear what the issue is from your point of view and what you want us to do about it. And then we'll ask you any questions of clarification at the end. So fire away.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Tamahere Community Committee, for whom I'm speaking on behalf of today, has made a reasonable effort, we hope, to look at changes in the plan that may affect our area. So I'm really concentrating on the Tamahere Country Living Zone in what I'm presenting today. The first thing we were supporting was the minor dwellings changes, and the fact of calling them minor dwellings as opposed to dependent relatives. We think that the change, which I believe has been accepted at this point in the new plan, takes away any requirement for a relative to live in the dwelling, and that levels the playing field for every resident. We also support the changes that have been made in some of the definitions. Well, I say that with a reservation. I'm still having discussions with the Section 42A report writer, just to clarify some of the issues around kitchens, number of kitchens, and how that's interpreted through council. So I just make a reservation that further, as this process continues, we may want to just work through that. It's a little bit hard when things cross boundaries between hearings and finding them and being able to say the right thing at the right time.
Imagine how we feel.
Oh, I totally take my hats off to you, don't worry. The 20-metre proximity of these minor dwellings to the main dwelling is something that we think maybe needs a bit more of a look at. There's a 20-metre rule currently, and we understand that these dwellings should use a single entranceway, and the services and the reasons for that are very clear. But sometimes the topography of the land, or say trees or other features, may mean that we would like discretion to be available for that 20 metres to be varied, if for good reason. And so we'd like to think that that was allowed for. Also, if the person in the dwelling isn't a relative, you may not really want them quite as close as 20 metres. So I think with...
That might apply if they were a relative too, of course.
Yes, you're probably right there too. So I guess that's just a paraphrase of our points on the minor dwelling rules.
Okay, thank you.
The next submission relevant is the home occupation conditions. And this is one that our group and our area are really concerned about. The taking out of Chapter 23 of a lot of the specific rules for country living zone and reverting to Chapter 14 is a cause for concern. We understand why, because there are now going to be more country living zones in the district. Currently, we only really have had Tamahere, and it's been a little bit of a test case, I guess. With our zone having a special character, and I note that that was discussed quite a bit by Mr. Bridger, the reason that people have wanted to take up living in the country living zone, as you pointed out, or Mr. Cooney did, people want to live there because there's space, because it's a residential area, because they can build a larger home, or they can have more larger trees or whatever. They can even have an animal for agriculture day or whatever. There's lots and lots of benefits that might cause somebody to want to be there. But being residential is the key thing. So we're pretty happy with being allowed to, someone having a home occupation that's small, that's limited to 2 people, and that the occupation is within the area of the house or ancillary buildings. And we support that that's what has been proposed in this new plan. The timing of being able to operate machinery is definitely something we oppose, because reverting to Chapter 14 means it's 9 o'clock at night, and we're not happy with that. It previously has been 7 at night. So we don't accept that, but I do note that there has been changes made in the recommendations in the Section 42 report. The heavy vehicle movements and the vehicle movements have also been commented on by New Zealand Transport Authority. And the Section 42 report relates or speaks to that, in that it's going to be discussed in another section. We want to put on record right now that we live in a country living zone that's primarily residential, and to allow up to 100 heavy vehicle movements, sorry, I've got that wrong, to have no limit on heavy vehicle movements a day, and to have up to 100 for a private business in a small cul-de-sac, just relating to that, is not acceptable. And it's not something that anybody that lives there signed up for. And we have had cases in the last 10 years where people have unknowingly set up a business in those areas, and people have become aware because of the number of movements, the number of the noise, the activities that are carrying on. And fortunately, we've been able to, through council, have discussions with those people, and they've relocated to a more suitable zone or environment. If those disappear, I have grave concerns for the lifestyle that we've paid to have, and have had certainty from our district plan that we could have. So that's really, really, I really want to emphasise that those vehicle movements, the heavy vehicle and the normal vehicles, very important. As to is the recommendation by the planner, I think there's a typo if you have a look in the paragraphs where the recommendations are made, because I believe that they're meant to say from 7:30, the business operation from 7:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. in both those cases, but in fact somehow they got muddled up. But that's all written in the submission that I've got. That's that. Sorry, I've gone on about that a wee bit in this.
No, that's okay. It's fine.
The next area was building coverage, and we do support the change to the building coverage rule, in that the previous rule was a little bit restrictive, and it caused just about every build to require to get resource consent. So the fact of it now being able to be 10% or 300 square metres, whichever is the greater, we think that's sensible. We support that. We agree with the analysis on page 104, but we reserve the right to comment on the results of the adoption of the planning standards definition and consequential changes to the rules, because in paragraph 435 it says that they'll be considered comprehensively towards the end of the hearing. It's a bit hard at this stage when we don't know what's been discussed or suggested.
No, we understand that. That's because early in the process the panel identified a need to be as consistent with those national planning standards as we can, and we've asked the staff to report back on that to us. But as part of that exercise, obviously people like yourselves and all the submitters need to know what it is that's being proposed. So you don't need to worry about that. You'll get the opportunity to comment.
Fine, yep. The next area is general subdivision lot size, and we've talked a bit about that already this afternoon. We actually support the maintenance of 5,000 square metre minimum lot size, and that's after a discussion with a wide group of people who are currently resident in the guinea pig area of Tamahiri Country Living Zone. We believe that in any case, a lot of the residences that have been built in this zone are built in such a way that cutting the or subdividing the lots would be very difficult, and we'd end up with some very odd shaped, horrible looking subdivision. We also believe that the rules regarding access to these lots, whether they be rights of way or roads, have been, the consents have been given and the requirements devised on the basis of that number of dwellings and road users using those spaces. And certainly all the development that's occurred in the Tamahiri hub area, where the school is in the commercial area, has all been geared to the potential number of lots in that country living zone based on 5,000 square metres. So we've got the situation that there are definitely some that could be further subdivided if that lot size reduced. But the unfortunate thing is that when that happens, the person next door doesn't get to say whether or not they want neighbours that close, whereas they bought into a zone that had a 5,000 square metre rule. And also, if the 12-metre boundaries are to be maintained from the setbacks, the 12-metre setbacks, that then, as I said before, might create some very ugly looking and not properly planned lot subdivision. People come to the country living zone, as I said before, for space, and they know that they're going to have water restrictions and they'll have a trickle supply only. They geared up for all those sorts of things. Some people have difficulties with their septic tank services and stormwater disposal, and 5,000 square metres just gives a little bit of surety that those problems are able to be dealt with. In relation to this, I do want to make the point that the subdivision grids that were given in the Section 42A report that seemed to exclude Tamahiri, although Tamahiri was there, but then the analysis that was written didn't, and it was rather confusing to understand. And it might be useful to have that rewritten for consideration as to what it actually meant, because I felt that it implied there were a lot more spare lots available in Tamahiri than I actually think is actual. Because yes, there's a couple of large areas that can still be subdivided that haven't been done so yet, but there's not a lot of odd ones around, and it felt to me like the potential further yield was higher than it might actually be. It was very difficult to get from those figures. So I guess we support the 5,000 square metres, and in doing so leads to our next point about the airport outer noise zone. And we actually quite strongly believe that there's not very many unsubdivided areas within that area now, and we can't see any reason why they should be treated any different to every other block of land. The old rule requiring the 1.1 hectare average was followed, and guess what? All the small sections got bought just the same as the big ones did. There's no evidence to show that there's been reverse sensitivity against the airport. People buying where they buy, they know the airport's there. In fact, when the vast majority of those sections were purchased, the airport was a heck of a lot busier than it is today, as has been pointed out, if we look at the airport's activities over a period of time. The flights in and out have declined substantially. I guess we shouldn't take now into consideration, but to almost, hardly any. So I think with the acoustic building rules that are there and the things that are available, the products, there's no reason that the property shouldn't be subdivided to a 5,000 square metre average, just the same as everybody in the country living zone. I also think that if you're worried about that, we could have some covenants on the land that says that anybody buying those already know that that could be an issue, and that they let the buyer beware. And I think we would end up with a much more orderly environment. Because let's face it, 1.1 hectares is a big lawn to mow. It's not really big enough to have stock. And in our area now, stockyards are becoming quite redundant and difficult, and we've got people who don't want to have animals or have to look after them, and they're trying to move a few animals from a block down the road where a guy's got, 2,000 square metres fenced off, and in the summer when there's no grass, it's not a nice situation. So we do support the other submitters who have submitted to allow that 1.1 hectare limit to be reduced to 5,000 square metres. And lastly, the building setbacks in Tamahere commercial areas A and B. Those setbacks are important. They do need to be there, and I just felt that the way it's been written in the new district plan needs a little bit of tweaking to just confirm that people are still able to build non-habitable buildings or accessory buildings within that 100 metres. It's only dwellings that are excluded. So that's just really a wording thing, and we don't support it as it's written because it implies that you can't build in that area. But it's a whole lot of land when you've got a 100 metre setback, and it can be used for something. So that's from us at this point for the Hearing 12 submissions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mrs. Robertson. Let's just see if there's any questions. Mr. Fulton.
Thank you, Sue. I think congratulations on a very, very concise and a very clear submission. We knew the point you were trying to make very, very clearly, and I really appreciate having a submission that's so clear as yours. And I think we also realised that Tamahere was set up in a different position to what all the new ones will be, the likes of Tika Wharas and so on. Didn't have a base, whereas yours started off from 10-acre blocks and then them being subdivided. So it's a different setup to what we're going to have as we go through the rest of the district. But yeah, really appreciate your submission today. Thank you.
Mr. Kearney.
You say in your submission that the Tamahere community strongly values its country living zone amenity value and seeks to maintain it and not have it eroded. And we've been faced with reducing the 5,000 minimum lot size to 3,000 to 4,000 to an averaging. What's the community's view of that?
Well, we're very happy with the 5,000 as it is at the moment. That was the general consensus when we were looking at this.
Did you canvass your members out there?
We didn't canvass them as in having a poll or as in
No.
formally, but our group, we have 14 people on our committee now, and they come from various areas within the ward, and we sort of try within our areas to gauge the sentiment and then come together to do these sorts of things. So it's a feeling, I guess, from a gathering of feelings and discussions.
And what's the main thing why people choose that lifestyle? Is it the open space and that type of thing?
I think a lot of it is the open space. It's the ability to put up a rugby goalpost or a soccer net, and to have a couple of lambs raised for Agriculture Day, to be able to have a big lawn, a swimming pool maybe, to be able to ride their bikes around and around and have huts and things like that. It's lifestyle.
Okay, thank you.
There's just one, I think, from me, Mrs. Robertson. You've mentioned in a couple of places when you've talked about how the operative plan has limitations on heavy truck movements, for example, and a number of other things. And then when you've talked about that, you've mentioned figures that would apply in Chapter 14 of the plan by way of, up to 100 truck movements a day, using that as a for instance. Why have you referred to Chapter 14?
Because when we tried to find the particular things that are in the operative plan, in the new plan, we couldn't. To see whether they were still all, what's changed, we looked through Chapter 23 and couldn't find some of the things that defined the rules. I
understand that. Chapter 14 has no relationship to this zone. All the rules for the country living zone are in Chapter 23. So if there's a permitted...
We were told by the council or staff at the council that in an attempt to align all the zones, that they were all going to draw from the same place in Chapter 14, and that's where we got these numbers from.
I don't read Chapter 14 as applying here, but Ms. Ratt or Ms. Chibnall might be able to clarify that for me.
Perhaps I can clarify that. I think it's what they're referring to is the traffic generation rules, which are in Chapter 14 towards the back. It's about 14.12.
Yeah. Where does Chapter 23 cross-reference that though? Because there's nothing in Chapter 23 that says, at least that I can see, that says you've also got to go back to Chapter 14 to look for some other rules.
I think it's right at the very start of Chapter 23, like right at the very heading.
You might need to tell me that offline because I can't find it. I don't believe it's here, but.
Yeah, it does. 3, the activity status tables.
Oh, I'm sorry, there it is.
Following chapters, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Okay, no, I'm sorry, it is there. I stand corrected. I see it now. Okay, I understand. Sorry, just ignore that mental aberration on my part. I now see the point that you're making, and it's clear. Thank you. No, I don't think I have anything else either. Thank you. That's pretty clear. I think we understand what it is you're seeking and the reasons why. So thank you very much. And hopefully the new technology wasn't too daunting.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the submitters that want to be heard. We do need to have a conversation, I think, with Ms. Chibnall and Ms. Ratt on where to from here. I think the panel have a number of questions that have arisen during the day that may well be matters that we'd appreciate some further information about. I'm not certain that there's a lot of value to be had in having an off-the-cuff response to what's been heard in submissions. I think the rest of the panel feel free to comment. I think we're going to benefit more if we get something that's thought through and put in writing. But I think, taking Mr. Cooney's point from earlier, I think we can probably go through our notes sort of point by point, and just so that we've got a collective list of the things that we do think that would be helpful to get further information about. So the panel happy? Are they happy with that approach?
Yeah, I think so, Phil. Yep.
Anyone got a problem with that approach? All right. Well, maybe we can just go back to the start. I'm not sure how we want to do this. Ms. Chibnall, do you want to tell us what you think you're going to do, or do you want us to go through this point by point and tell you what we think would be helpful to get feedback on?
Yes, I think I would prefer you to tell me what you'd like to have feedback on.
I thought you were going to say that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I just think that if the panel pipe up, if we go through things in terms of the order that we've heard them, and we'll just, if I go past something that you want to raise, sing out, I think we'll just have to do this a little bit casually, if that's okay with folk. First one is, should there be a zone statement or overall objective for what the purpose of the zone is in whatever way, shape or form?
Yeah, I agree there should be. I think there should be an explanation as to the purpose of that zone, because I think that'll become important when we bring all this stuff into the national policy standards, planning standards.
Okay, no, that's good. There's the question around the avoid policy and prohibition and the linkage between the policy and the rules and making those consistent.
Yep, I think it should be looked at, and I think your point was a good one there, Phil, about that. I haven't thought through where that finishes up, but maybe Susan can she can have a look at that and come back to us.
Yeah,
Phil,
I think we're.
Phil, sorry, can I just interrupt? Are we continuing to record and have the submitters involved?
I was just going to raise that. I just wanted to say to the submitters, the purpose of this is not for us to be telling anybody what our decisions are, because we haven't made any. It's simply to record the sorts of things that we've asked questions of people about that we would appreciate a staff view in writing on, so that we have a means of hopefully coming to a better decision in due course. So we're not here discussing the merits of any of the points that are being made. We're simply getting a list of things that we're going to get some further information around. So on that basis, I think given that we're still in hearing mode, I'm happy that we continue with that, but we'll just be very mindful not to express any views on outcome. And if we are, it's in the context of understanding what's being sought, not because we agree or disagree with it.
And continue recording as well, Phil?
I think so, yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
The next one I had was, it would be helpful, I think, and it sort of came up in Ms. Robertson's view, where she made a lot of cross-referencing back to what the existing plan allowed and didn't allow and what's now proposed. It would be helpful for us, I think, to have a list that compared some of the key activities that apply, what the operative plan says about activity status, and what the proposed plan says about activity status. And that's more by way of background to us, just to understand where things have been tightened, where they've been loosened, and those sorts of things. They were the only ones that I've noted specifically related to Ms. Chibnall's presentation before we moved on to the submitters. Is there anything that I've missed off that list that people want to raise?
I had a couple of other things that that the panel raised in the opening before we got to submitters. I had Mr. Cooney said he was not sure that the wording of the amended noise rule made sense, because it doesn't say where the noise is to be measured from. I had that one.
Yes.
I had the intention for the objectives to apply or not apply. That was yours, Dr. Mitchell. Then the plan should be explicit as to whether those objectives and policies apply or don't, particularly
yes, actually, thank you. I've noted that on my paper, but I didn't read it out. Thanks.
I also had Mr. Cooney asked the question that this was in reference to undiscovered heritage items and archaeological discoveries, and looked at the matters of discretion for general subdivision, whether these could include wording that allows a reference to areas of value that are discovered, that aren't known.
That's correct.
And then I had yours, Dr. Mitchell, about preparing a high-level table that compares activity status of proposed versus the district plan to see whether there's been a softening and a strengthening, which I've already said.
That's helpful, thank you. In terms of Ms. Galt from Hamilton City, I don't think there's anything that's arisen in relation to her submission that we require any further information on. Does anyone have anything on that list?
I just thought, and it's part of your what you've said earlier, that we should. I'm a little bit confused as to what the operative plan says about development in that area, and we can compare the two then. So it'll form part of that schedule you've asked for.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. In terms of Mr. Fuller and Mr. Hartley, we've given Mr. Hartley the opportunity to come back with something more specific in terms of his averaging rules, and he said we could do this and we could do that, and I think we've already said we're not inclined to do that and just make it up ourselves. If he's got a particular proposal, we're happy to hear from him. That's the only one that I've got in relation to them. I don't believe there's anything new that's arisen in relation to that, but correct me if I'm wrong. Sounds like that's okay. Mr. Cooney, maybe you can take over and talk about Mr. Crisp's issues, given my conflict with that matter.
No, I don't think, I haven't got any notes there, but maybe the others. Remember that Mr. Crisp is seeking a 3,000 square metre minimum area. That was the main thrust of his submission. So, Linda, do you have any comments there?
I guess just the question that he raised for us to think about, which was, what would the consequences be if that change were to be made? And how would they line up with, and it goes back to that point about what is the meaning of country living, what's the whole objective of this? And so what would the consequences be that would not be in alignment with the overall objective or purpose of the zone?
When you say the consequences, do you mean the additional number of lots?
Yeah, reducing the lot size from 5 to 3, the minimum lot size.
Yeah.
Just not on the merits of that, but what is it you'd be asking Ms. Chibnall to do? Or is that a matter for us to deliberate on in due course?
He asked what would the consequences be. So he read the reasons as to why the Section 42 reporter didn't agree with reducing the lot size, but he couldn't see what the negative consequences would be in terms of what the purpose of the zone was.
Yeah, I didn't think that there was anything different in what he had to say to what the likes of Mr. Bridges also had to say about wanting to reduce it to 4,000. So I think the argument about that is not peculiar to one size or another, even down to 2,500. So I don't think there's anything more we need to have on that. I think it's a decision we need to work through.
All right. Yeah, I think Linda's point can be looked at by you, Ms. Chibnall, about that.
I think the other thing too is there are two aspects to this. There's the list of things that we would find helpful that are specifically matters that we would like to get clarified. There may be things that you have heard in the course of the day that you would like the opportunity to clarify for us, even though it may not necessarily be exercising us too much. So if there are matters that you take strong exception to or have a difference of opinion on, or you've changed your mind on having heard certain bits of information, then we're very happy to receive that as well. So mate, we're only focusing on the first aspect of that. You're at liberty to reply on anything else you see fit that's altered or whatever your opinion on things. Okay. So if we move on to Mr. Finlay, which I don't think there's anything in relation to him that requires any further information. In terms of Mr. Howarth, I haven't got anything specific that requires a response. The one thing that I'm struggling to understand, though, in the context of this hearing, is that there in the plan itself, there are 3 different airport noise control measures shown on the planning maps. There's the airport noise outer control boundary, there's the airport subdivision control boundary, and there's the airport noise SEL 95 boundary. As far as I can tell, in chapter 23, there's one reference in a rule to the airport noise SEL 95 boundary in a rule, and there's reference in a number of places to the subdivision control boundary. I'm struggling to understand what all these boundaries are and whether they do or don't relate to this zone. I suspect they apply elsewhere, but I don't know that for a fact. So I think it would be, if the simple answer is don't worry about it because it doesn't apply, then that's fine. But I think if we were able to get a paragraph that actually says, you know, there are these 3 provisions, this is where you find them in the plan, and these are they are or aren't relevant to this particular chapter. Rock Properties. I don't think there's anything specifically that arises in relation to her, to Ms. Palmer's information. She has proposed a policy change that certainly for my mind, and I questioned her about it, it was vague and thought was capable of multiple interpretations. I think for the purposes of reply, if you're able to say whether you still oppose what she says or not, and if you don't, if you're persuaded by what she's had to say, maybe you could give some thought to how that policy should be worded in order to make it clear and unambiguous. And in fact, maybe do that anyway, even if you don't agree. Record what your view is, but tell us so that we at least have that in front of us. We can deal with it now. I think we'd appreciate you giving some thought to how Mr. Nation's issue around the field days issue, the field days complex noise provisions might reply. I think we've said, well, I have, and I'll only speak for me, have some sympathy for the general point that he's making, not because this plan controls it, but it does mean that it's probably helpful information to explain to people in Waikato District that are within that noise bubble that as he referred to it. So we haven't formed a view on what that should be, but I think we're sympathetic, at least in principle, to the point that he's making.
Just on that point, there's often methods of dealing with cross-boundary noise, and there's a delegation by one authority to another about the powers of an enforcement officer under the RMA and that type of thing. We don't want a complex explanation, but
no, absolutely.
To try and see how it can work for him, because he raises a good point.
I don't think there's anything in relation to the airport submission other than I think we'd appreciate your view on the policy wording and the activity status that applies to it, what your final view on that might be. I don't think there's anything specific that arose out of Mr. Hartley's evidence and presentation that requires any further evaluation from staff. I haven't got anything on my list. I thought that was quite clear cut. Anyone disagree or have anything to add? I think the same applies to Mr. Bridger. I think the same applies to Fish and Game. I don't think there's anything that we need clarity on, further clarification on that, other than, I suppose, to maybe respond to his point about consistency, whether you think there is an issue of consistency that should apply or shouldn't with the reason for it. And then there's from Mrs. Robertson. I don't believe there's anything that's risen out of her presentation that requires any further information as such, but obviously we're keen in your reply to hear what your view on her submission and all of those that went before were. Does that sound like a complete enough list, folks?
Yep, I'm happy with that.
Yep.
Are you happy with that, Ms. Chibnall?
Yeah, I'm
Ms.
sure
Rath?
that will keep us out of trouble.
What do you, and we're not asking this to put pressure on you, but what do you think your time frame for providing that information is likely to be? 20 to 5 now.
Quarter past.
I can see, I can see a good week.
Oh no, we're not putting any. You just tell us when it'll be available,
Okay.
and we're happy with that. And if you need to add a few more days on the end to give yourself comfort that you know,
Okay.
we'd
Yeah.
rather you to under promise and over deliver than the other way around.
Sophie, you've got Easter in there as well.
Oh, true. Yes. Okay. All right.
How about we say the end of next week?
And
And if there's a problem with that, you could just relay that via Ms. Kelly. She can reply to us if you've run out of time for whatever reason.
okay. Cool. End of next week.
And
How does
that's
that sound?
got to be circulated to all the parties.
Yeah, and that will need to be circulated to the parties and posted on the website.
Can I just clarify, there was one bit I missed. So we talked about field days and the complex noise provisions.
Yes.
And see if we can find a way to make this work. And then there was something in between, and then talked about policy wording and activity status for subdivision within the airport subdivision control area, but I missed that one in between.
I don't think there was anything in between.
Okay.
Oh, that's what's the Bow Rock submission.
There was nothing that arose. I didn't think there was anything that arose out of Bow Rock. It's Miss Palmer. So I think I'm satisfied that we have all the information in terms of understanding her submission, and we don't need any information in order to understand it. But if you have a view on what she said, as I said in relation to all the submitters, your reply is totally entitled to say, well, I've heard all of this information today, I've heard the questions from the panel, and my view is the same as it was, or it's changed. That's simply so that everybody knows what your final view is, having heard all the information. Just like it would be at the end of a consent hearing, you know, the applicant has a right of reply, and we're applying that same general approach to here, given that you guys are the people that have proposed the plan. You've provided evidence. The submitters have come along and spoken today. We've asked questions that may have, you know, added something else that you think might have been relevant that you hadn't thought of before, or whatever, and you've then got the opportunity to comment on it. So we're not. Yeah, you can be as broad as you want, or as narrow as you want. It's entirely up to you.
And your response, for example, when you go through to reply to the submissions we've heard today, you could say that that the panel has raised this issue. My comments are these, and then get on to, you know, what they have said as well, in terms of your whether you changed your view or not.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we're at the end. The panel. What I think we might do is we'll conclude the hearing in a minute. I just want to say a couple of things before we do that. And then all the people that aren't on the panel or advising the panel directly, we should just have a quick chat about where to from here, from our own point of view. But what I just want to say in conclusion to thank everybody for participating in this forum. I think it's been pretty effective. I certainly don't feel, having listened to anything, that we've been disenfranchised in any way by not being in a hearing room listening to people face to face. The technologies work really well. I think Ms. Palmer had a bit of a funny internet connection and we struggled to hear her a little bit, but not to the point of not understanding what she said. But everything else has gone like clockwork, it seems to me, and I'm quite encouraged about how this might work going forward. So thank you everybody for participating and for your contributions. And I think on that basis, we'll adjourn the hearing and we'll ask the parties that aren't actually part of the hearing panel or part of the advisors to the panel to disconnect, and then we can just continue our discussions in private.